Hey everyone, it's Tony here from Coalition for Marriage. We've got a video coming up for you now, only it's not a video, it's just the sound because we lost the video recording, but it's something really, really worth listening to, somebody really worth listening to, a real superstar, a real British hero. I hope you enjoy what's coming up next. Welcome everyone to the Coalition for Marriage YouTube channel. Privileged to have you back. If you're joining us as usual, if you're a first-time viewer, then it's great to have you too. And you've joined a very special time today. We have our first Olympian on the channel today. It's a real privilege to welcome Alex Storey. Alex, would you like to say hello?
Hello everyone.
Alex, now you are a world champion oarsman. You're an Olympic rower. You've held a world record. You're a regular writer. But I wanted to talk to you because you've got a view on family and growing up in family and the benefits that that brings, which I think some of our viewers would appreciate hearing your position on. Just to remind viewers and participants, we are the UK's largest pro-marriage organisation, representing groups and individuals across the UK who support this notion of one man, one woman marriage. And let me say, as I often do straight away, that doesn't mean other things don't exist in a liberal democracy. Of course they do. But we think that there's something special about one man, one woman marriage, something unique about the contribution it brings to civil society, to the participants and children, and really that it has a role to play in producing the best version of the next generation, which is quite unique. And Alex, I heard you interviewed recently by Jordan Peterson, and you mentioned a few things that I wanted to pick up on firstly. And I've listened to some of your other interviews and some of the other stuff you've done publicly. And I wonder if we could start a little bit further back, before your Olympic career maybe. And I'm interested in the making of an Olympian. You've mentioned you were kicked out of school quite often. So can you tell us a little bit about the young Alex?
The young Alex is not too different from the older Alex. It's just that the older Alex is older and less mobile. And one of the things about me when I was younger was my reluctance to obey and my reluctance to fall into hierarchy. And it was something that was natural. I didn't pretend to be difficult. I was just very difficult. I was very argumentative. My dad was there. He was a presence in the house, but he worked very hard. My mother was there as well, but because she was there all the time, we had a very different relationship. She does have Christian roots, and in fact, so does my father. But I'm also the youngest of a family of 4 children, and all of them are big characters. And so I was perhaps as a youngest trying to struggle and find a way to be myself. And so when that was replicated in school, it just meant there was always combative. I was always trying to make a niche for myself, as it were. And so I didn't give teachers that much chance. But actually, there is also an important point, and I look back on it and I realize exactly when it was, and I think it was the mid-80s. I started getting kicked out of school because the school system defanged teachers and headmasters. And of course, when that was removed, suddenly I was free because there was no constraint on me. And so I did what I did, and the boundaries had gone. And so what happened was that the only thing that the headmaster or the school teacher could do was to kick me out of the school. And of course, what that did is that it shifted the problem. The school became unable to take responsibility for my behavior. And so they got me kicked out of the school. But that meant that I was the problem, and I was shifted to another school where I did the same thing. And it took a similar amount of time. After about 6 or 7 months, or perhaps a year, I would get into the same kind of trouble. Because the way that I dealt with my hyperactivity was to be physically active. That's obviously me, but I try always to invest some of my time in my children. So every Saturday I take the kids out and we go rowing, or I certainly try to walk out and do things with them outside of the house. My father took me rowing because he was an old school kind of guy. And for him, all this psychological babble, as he would call it, didn't feature. He just saw an unruly child And in the old days, an unruled child you discipline him by making him do physical things until he was so tired that by the time he came back at 7 p.m., the only two things he would do is he would eat and then he would go straight to sleep. The condition is what people are referring to, whether it's your child misbehaving or whether he has a gender dysphoria or whatever it might be. But all of these things actually are a product of a dissatisfaction or of an imbalance in the child or the human being's life. And the dissatisfaction with yourself, the self-harm and all of that comes from a lack of discipline, which is why I think the rowing for me was so fundamental, because it gave me a very strict routine, and that routine enables you to progress and to be so much more productive than you otherwise would have been.
You spoke about privilege. I've heard you speak about privilege, and your privilege, and specifically what you meant by that was the privilege of your upbringing and the privilege of growing up with your biological mum and dad in a relatively happy, stable home relationship, and the head start that gave you. Do you want to elaborate upon that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, I think like most of us, I think we all stem, regardless of what people might say or the media might say, we all come from one man and one woman. And I was privileged enough to know who my father was and who my mother was. And I was also even more privileged by the fact that I lived in the same house as both of them. And of course, I didn't just live in the same house as both my parents, my natural parents. It's also my brothers and sisters who were not stepbrothers or stepsisters, but my brothers and sisters. In fact, we were the same group of people. And you always have to go back to your parents. And if they're divorced, as a child, you're either just with your dad or either just with your mum. And eventually what you see is that over the course of time, every month or so, or every 2 months, your mum or your dad will come back with another concubine. And so the stability of the house, the sacrosanct nature of the house completely disappears. When I was a kid, although there were lots of strangers in the house, as in, friends of the family, cousins, and people from the outside, these four walls were the Storey family empire.
It was your safe place, wasn't it, really?
There was no question of it. There was never a moment where I thought, is that my dad or is that my mum? I knew this was the rock on which the Storey family was built.
Well, it's very, very interesting, because it goes back, you mentioned that the Christian heritage, if you like, of your parents. And that goes all the way back to Genesis, that, man is not good when he is alone. You're absolutely right. Man cannot do good on his own. He needs to, good is defined by the interaction with other people. I just want to finish off, because you got to Cambridge.
Yeah.
But for a boy that kept getting kicked out of school, you must have got something together in order to get into Cambridge.
As I said, it's once you set the routine, this is the interesting thing about talent, is that much of it is finding something that you love and persisting with it, and being, partially lucky. Luck has an enormous amount of say over whether you're successful or not. And I think a lot of people forget that. So, and I was taught that after my injuries, because before the injuries, I felt relatively invincible because I'm 6'8", because I was very strong, because I could run for hours, and I was physically in a position where I never really felt tired unless I pushed myself in a rowing race to the limit. But it also meant that I forgot the privilege of rowing for a team like the Great British Olympic team or the Cambridge Boathouse, which was that everything was done for you. And that's not good when you're 17. It's not good when you're 18, when people make your meals, or they clean your clothes, or they organize your schedule. And it's not good, because it makes you feel that this is an entitlement. But going back to before the sense of entitlement, before you get to that, you realize, and you're desperate to be able to get to that stage. You're desperate to represent your country, or you're desperate to race or take part in these international races. So everything becomes really, really simple. It becomes very clear. You need to do X, Y, and Z in order to get to that point over there. Yep. And that once you work this out at the age of 13, 14, everything becomes relatively clear. And this minefield of what people call the teenage years becomes a relatively easy pass or rite of passage into manhood, because the landmines that we now see would be sex, drugs, girls, alcohol, blah, blah, blah. When you're a rower, you know that if you smoke a cigarette, you'll be in so much pain the next day when you're racing. You do it once and you never do it again.
In terms of your dad and your dad's effects on your ability to cope with difficulty and struggle as it challenged you in your life, how did you feel that that's kind of helped you and pushed you forward? Because rowing's not an easy thing to do, is it? It's a very, very hard, grueling sport to choose.
It really is a sport that demands complete dedication, even if you're never going to make it beyond the county level or the national level. It's you always need to train much more than you'd expect. My father is still a great academic. He's also an opera singer, but he was this sort of Damocles in our house. He was, the moment he walked into the house, things went quiet in the house. So for instance, if I'd had bad grades, I could argue with my mother. When I heard the footsteps on the gravel just in front of the house, these 10 yards, I could hear these large footsteps going, crunch, 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 getting closer and closer to the house. The more I realized what my status was, which was I was a little kid who'd gone a little bit too far. So all sorts of things like contrition came along. And so that's one of the many lessons. That's him as a disciplinarian. But actually, there's also this sense of letting you down. And of course, if you love someone, you don't want to let them down.
And maybe the fatherless crisis, the fatherless epidemic, is one thing that's leading to so many young people with tissue-thin skin, that they're offended at the slightest possible thing, or the wrong inflection, or microaggressions.
Well, exactly. There's a combination of things. So the first thing is that when there's a father in the house and you have brothers and sisters, you have to try and negotiate for life, where you have to negotiate for that extra piece of cake, during your tea time. When you have a father figure there, certain rules of the game are established. And this is in a very chaotic world. This is essentially the type of privilege that having a mother and a father does to you. It's the same tree in many ways. You've got the same roots, and the love is ever present. And there is this sense that I hear that very often from people who are trying to dismantle the family, and they'll say, well, it's better to have parents that are divorced than parents who are married but don't get along. You go, well, actually, but it's better to have parents who love one another and who realize and who act on the premise that they need to control themselves as well.
The empirical evidence is very clear on that, and I know you're a prolific reader and you're an excellent writer on some of these subjects as well. And I'm just wondering, because you've got a good take on, even though the evidence says that, look, we should be promoting growing up with your married mum and dad, because that's the thing that seems to work for society, yet we're not doing. What in your mind, why are we not doing the thing that's most obvious and that ought to be done? What's going on in the background?
It's been a shift away from the old religion. And I know it sounds odd to say this, but you have to put it into a time frame in order to realize where we are. In 312, Constantine converted to Christianity, and in doing so, Western Europe became Christian. And that meant that suddenly the gospel became the official philosophy of the continent. And that doesn't mean to say there were not teething pains, or there weren't people who were fitting their worldview into the gospel. But the important point was that the broad principle of Christianity were diffused throughout the Roman Empire, which was an intellectual empire with libraries, with debating chambers, with roads and connections. So things could be discussed and debated. And the interesting thing was that we in 312 became officially Christian, but we left Christianity officially in 2005. And a lot of people say, but what do you mean 2005? Well, we left it officially in 2005 when Giscard d'Estaing came back and finalized the European Constitution. In that European Constitution, there was no mention at all of Christianity, but you had mentions of ancient Rome, ancient Greece, and the Enlightenment. So much so that the president of Poland at the time said, this is an obvious desire to erase Christianity from the map. Mm. At the time when I saw this, I thought to myself, I don't understand why they're doing that. It might be an oversight or the error or perhaps the accident. That was really prevalent in my mind 20 years ago. But as I've grown up, I realized it's not an accident, but it's policy. It's driven on purpose. And the reason for this, I think, the more I think about it, the more I realize that the problem with Christianity is that it requires self-imposed constraints. If you're a super wealthy individual, why shouldn't you take advantage of the poorest? Why should you not have sex with a 12-year-old girl? Why should you do all of these things? Well, the only barrier to all of this is our inherited morality, which is based on the gospel. I think what I've realized is that what we're witnessing is a policy that is basically anti-human. It says more human beings are bad. And of course, that's a very short-term thing. And it's based on a couple of ideologies, which obviously one of them is eugenics, which I mentioned in my Jordan Peterson podcast. Mm. But the hatred of humanity is essentially the core of what we're seeing. Because you're right, we know, we've got all the facts. We know that a mum and a dad lead to a fundamentally more stable family structure, to children who know where they're fit. They understand what love means and what negotiation with other human beings mean. All of this is known. We also know that discipline leads to a safer society. We know that constraints mean that you're a happy human. You're happier human being because you can express yourself and become good at one thing, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not an accident. What we're living through is a direct frontal attack on our humanity by a very powerful but small and very shallow group of human beings who have somehow taken control of the NGOs, the corporate world through the HR departments, through most of the universities and much of the media. I just want to read you an article, or at least the title of an article by a professor at Cambridge called David Runciman. But his article in Foreign Policy, a magazine, left-wing magazine, is "Democracy is the planet's biggest enemy." Why is democracy the biggest enemy of the planet? Because you can't have a revolution when you have negotiations. If you take the humanity of each, and when you say every human being is sacred and they each have the right to express themselves, what you're also saying is that no solution is easy because you have to try and take someone else's point of view. And of course, if you're an intellectual and you live in Cambridge, you might think that you know a great deal up until the moment when the plasterers come to your house and they tell you something and you have no idea either how to resolve the problem or what he's talking about. And then you realize how little you actually know. But these professors rarely put themselves in that position of introspection. They just assume that they know better. And you and I know, because we're witnessing it, that according to our views of the world, they are always wrong. And they're always wrong because we can see the results. Less discipline in schools, more crime. If you allow drugs to take place, more children would destroy their lives, less future.
And that's it. The more crime thing is a really interesting one, because if you look at the charting children born out of marriage, and you lay on top of that the chart of reported crimes, there's very, very strong correlation. You know, kids growing up without dads, way more likely to get involved in the criminal justice system. Girls way more likely to get pregnant before they're 20. Way more likely to drop out of school. You look at the prison population, you know, it's evident there that what you're saying kind of bears fruit in real life.
But the point is, what do they believe? If what they believe is that fewer human beings is a good thing, then getting rid of people early is a good thing. So that's where morality comes in so strongly. That's the reason why when you read the gospel, good and bad is defined in such stark ways. What they want is a world with fewer human beings. That's why eugenics is so important. That's why Keynes is so important, because Keynes was the president of the Eugenics Society of Great Britain from 1937 to 1944.
And that's a very interesting time to be president of such an organization, one might.
Well, of course, but that's the reason why, as I said, if I write a book, I'd want to call it the Asterix, because shamefully, Lord Sadelsky wrote tons and tons of volumes on Keynes and never mentions the most important part of Keynes's philosophy, which is that he was the chief eugenicist in the UK from his time at Cambridge before the First World War to his last speech in 1946 at the Galton Institute, where he says that eugenics is the most important field of sociology. The Galton Institute, by the way, Galton was the cousin of Darwin, which is one of the reasons why I call these characters, including Malthus, Marx, Darwin, and Keynes, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, because actually these four creatures there are other people who might or might not have been more influential in their time. It's just that these four guys are completely encrusted in our Western European education system. Malthus is in geography, Darwin is in biology, Keynes is in economics, and Marx is in politics. These four guys are essentially the four pillars of the intellectual arena that we propose to our children. When Malthus starts to expound on this, the interesting thing is that he starts to say there's such a thing as a life worth living, which is dependent on your income. And he's been wrong the moment he put pen to paper, and he's been wrong from then to now. And yet he's still one of the four cornerstones of our education system. But it's the same thing with Keynes, and it's the same thing with Darwin, and the same thing with Marx. Marx has been wrong all the time.
Yeah, Marx, of course, classically to abolish the family, a primary objective. And again, because families pass on traditions from one generation to the next, they don't need a big state, they're quite self-sufficient, and that's something which is not very useful if you want to exert power.
Well, this is one of the things, what I recommend to people is not to read secondary literature about somebody, but to read the primary texts, because the masks slip very quickly. The reason why I mentioned Darwin is because Darwin, if you read about him, he explains geopolitics on the basis of race in a way that wasn't necessarily true for everyone at the time, because he was writing in the 1850s. But he essentially, the last book he wrote is Descent. In the last sentence of his book, he says, "I would rather be descendant from a monkey than a savage."
Really?
And the savage in those days wasn't Africa, because very few people had gone to Africa. It was the people that he saw on his way around Argentina, and that's the reason why the book is called the origins of the species and of the favored races.
And of course, we blot out or airbrush out the favored races bit from Darwin, don't we?
It's the most important part in many ways. It's like in Marx, if you read the Communist Manifesto in chapter 2, the most important thing, there are a few people who say it's not, it's the allocation of capital. No, that's misunderstanding. Marx says the most extreme position he has, and he has quite a few, is the destruction, the abolition of the family, because he calls it a capitalist construct. And what he means by that is what you said earlier, which is it's the incubator, essentially the well that sprinkles on the traditional grounds, and every season these traditions are revived and they are strengthened, and they become more and more meaningful as I get older. For instance, with my children, I try to keep to the Christian calendar as much as I want, because I want them to be able to impart what I've received from my great-grandparents onto their grandchildren.
Yeah.
I want continuity and stability.
Yeah. Is that what gave you a thought to go to have a go at going into politics? Was it because you wanted to kind of influence this agenda?
No, not at all. Actually, funny, that's something that I stumbled across, because I never agreed with the sentence extremes meet in the middle. And I think
yeah, that's right.
we should never accept that sentence,
Mm.
because what we are, I think, is, although we are emotional creatures trying to be rational, we also believe in the definition of words. We know that words mean certain things. It's crucial for us, if we're going to fight back, that we agree the definition of words, and we do not allow ourselves to be shunted aside by people who try to redefine words. Of course, part of the discussion at the beginning was marriage. I don't want marriage to be redefined. Yep. In fact, the law was the redefining of marriage. Marriage means something extremely specific. We should never accept it.
Yeah, you can't redefine it no more than you can redefine the definition of salt. It is
Absolutely
what it is. You can't redefine it.
It's what it is. If you put new ingredients in the recipe, well, it tastes differently.
Absolutely.
It's a different meal.
It affects everything, just like society is being affected by an attempt at definition now. You're quite right. You mentioned extremes. They can't meet in the middle. You've also mentioned that the extreme left is exactly the same as the extreme right, and that's quite profound. So, what scope is there for diversity in politics in that case?
The way I frame it, it's the question of elegance, and I think we, as people who are essentially trying to create a set of resistance nodes to fight back against what's quite clearly insane, we have to understand that our solidity comes from not accepting false premises. And when somebody says extremes meet in the middle, it doesn't work. But what we realize with all these guys of the left, or the extreme right, as we call it in today's world, is that human beings are not individuals. They all talk about the general good, not the individual, not the rights of the individual, but the right of the greater proportion. And so that means that they can appoint themselves as self-righteous, because they know best, because they can direct, so they know what the general humanity requires. And so the way that I say it is that Malthus, Darwin, Marx, and Keynes are actually the four pillars of this arena. It means that Adolf Hitler is actually to the right of Joe Stalin, in the same way that the bronze medalist is to the right of the gold medalist. They're on the same podium, in the same arena, facing the same crowd, and they are where they are, where one segment of the population is self-righteous and has granted itself rights to smite or to destroy another part of humanity. That's one extreme. The other extreme, in infinity away, is love your neighbor as yourself.
So elaborate on that a little bit.
There is a reciprocity inherent in that view of the world. You love your God, you love your neighbor as yourself. You are the same as somebody else. There is no difference in the eyes of God between you and somebody else.
Yeah, you treat your neighbor as an individual, not as a member of a group, but as a distinct person in front of you.
Exactly. So the extreme,
and equal to you as well. That's fundamentally.
Well, absolutely,
important.
that's right. It's not beneath. Yeah. It's not above. It's not beneath. It's not left. It's not right. You're the same, and you will be judged in the same way.
And so you mentioned somewhere that door knocking persuaded you not to go into politics.
I was involved in politics for a long time. I stood for Parliament in 2005 in Denton and Reddish, not far away from Oldham, south of Manchester. Then I stood in Wakefield for 3 really fun years. And I stood there in 2010, and I stood in Leeds Northwest, and eventually I won the seat of Yorkshire and the Humber for the European Parliament. But the story is that I got the letter from the returning officer saying, this is now your seat. But the Conservative Party decided to put somewhere else in my seat because it's a corrupt organization, and they didn't really care about what the electorate said. They wanted somebody who was going to toe the party line, which is one of the reasons why I gave up on politics. It's not, I learnt a huge amount from door knocking, and I realized how little I knew and how fragile theories that I learnt at university, including economic theory from people like Keynes, were, and how irrelevant most of these theories were to the broad majority of people who lived the lives they lived according to the precepts that they had. And the more doors I knocked on, the more I loved the people I spoke to, the more I realized that I didn't know very much. And by not knowing very much, I became paranoid. So I read more. So it was a spur to read more and more about stuff, and
Excellent.
to be inquisitive, and not to repeat what I was told from London, which is partially one of the reasons why I think the Conservative Party did what they did in 2016, because they realized that Alex, in their vocabulary, would be a maverick.
How fascinating.
And they don't want that. But I spent a lot of time and a lot of capital on politics. And as I said before, I really ended up loving the people of Yorkshire and Lancashire, because I just loved the idea of being able to speak on their behalf. And my firmness on certain views came from my observations, and having spoken to tens of thousands of people, I knew I could use these terms because they gave me the words and I interpreted them, and I managed to refashion sentences based on what they told me and my own observations. And so I left politics because the Tory party essentially told me, their deeds, not their words, that they didn't want people like me in office. So that's why I started writing, which is, my way of expressing what I see.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. And I know, so we've got supporters from all sorts of political backgrounds, so let me just put that out there straight away. Most of our supporters are Christians, but we've got a lot of people from other faiths too, and we've got some atheist supporters who are regular in contact, and they can see, as you mentioned, that actually structuring society around the precepts of one man, one woman marriage, and the importance of that, and society built from the ground up, is really important. And I suppose we've got to wrap up because you're a busy man. I appreciate your time. But thinking about rowing, kind of full circle, and where rowing has got to now in the sense of British rowing following world rowing and accepting men on women's rowing teams. Now that sounds, however you want to look at it, however you want to analyse it, something most peculiar and most bizarre. Where do we go from here? How do we extricate ourselves from this very complex, anomalous position that we find ourselves in?
I don't think it's complex, and I don't think it's very deep. I think it's very shallow as an ideology. I think it has no purchase anywhere in the world. I think it's laughable, and in fact, we have to call it for what it is. It's legalized insanity, and so we have to fight back against this. There is no ifs and buts. It's not a point where we can negotiate. A man is a man and a woman is a woman. That's it. The instances of exception are so minute that no laws can be passed that will do anybody any good. Because what we're essentially saying is that we will legislate for this tiny, perhaps 0.0001% of the population that has this issue. We will create confusion within the ranks of the large body of children and parents who no longer know where to turn to. I mean, everybody in their hearts knows what a man is and what a woman is. Women know that, men know that. Our leaders who are pushing this know this to be completely insane. But for some reason, there's been an establishment capture of the sinews of state and of power that are forcing this insanity on all of us. When we come back to the world of rowing, what's interesting, and this is an article I want to try and write, the men on the board voted against this absolute absurdity. They said, we can't have men rowing as women against women anywhere. And they're quite right. And they said, we've got daughters, but also less selfishly, I'm 6'8", I'm nearly 50, and I think I can beat the top women, gold medal women today.
Absolutely.
And that would be totally unfair on the women. And it's unfair on the women too, and they know that. And yet it is the women that voted for men to row as women against them. So that's an interesting thing, and that's something that I need to try and inquire. But why is it that women voted against themselves?
Fascinating. So, Alex, can I encourage you to write your book? I would love to read it. And if you do it, we'll have you back on and talk about it because I love your take on this. It's very refreshing and new. We have lots of different takes on why we are where we are, and yours is certainly an informative one and a unique one compared to many that I've spoken to. Very grateful for that. What's keeping you busy? What are you looking forward to writing apart from this book to doing, if you like? Because you've got a very active mind. What does the future hold for you?
Well, I'm first of all, I've got to keep my job. I have to feed the family,
Yeah.
and all of that. That's my priority. I think my wife's just in the corridor, and I'm saying that loud enough for her to hear it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Apart from that, I try to I work during the week. I try to write once a week a column, either in the Critic or in the Express. Sometimes, rarely in the Spectator, but sometimes,
Yep.
or in the National Review. At the moment, I was really busy on writing about democracy in the UK because of what we saw
Yep.
and my fears for it. But yeah, so I try to write once a week.
And you got a lovely family, a lovely growing family,
Yeah,
which
absolutely.
is
The
marvelous.
best thing I've
Yeah,
exactly the best thing I've ever
isn't
done.
it? And isn't marriage the hardest and the most wonderful thing too? And that's the great thing about that one as well, which a lot of people don't understand.
My point would be that I was lucky because I fell in love with my wife the day I saw her,
Ah,
and she fell in love with me as well, which is obviously quite surprising.
well,
So
yeah,
we didn't have to struggle at all, and
yeah.
as I say, it's the best thing I've ever done.
Alex Story, can I thank you for your time? Thank you for your contribution, and wish you all the best. And if you do, and when you do get your book published, let's come back and have another chat about that.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex.
My pleasure.